Imagine for a second um, a situation where someone is in actual physical danger, like a truly toxic, abusive environment.
Right.
Now imagine that they have a clear path to the exit, but instead of running for the door, they stay.
Which just goes against everything we think we know about survival.
Exactly. Not because they're physically trapped, but because the unconscious terror of being entirely alone on the other side of that door feels, well, infinitely more lethal than the danger they're currently in.
It's wild. It completely defies our basic instincts.
It totally does. But I think it highlights something profound for you listening. For some people, the fear of losing connection isn't just like a fleeting anxiety when a text goes unanswered. It is the absolute center of gravity in their life.
Oh, 100%. It dictates every choice, every relationship, every missed opportunity.
Right. And that is the core mission of our deep dive today. We're taking a stack of psychiatric history, diagnostic criteria, and psychological research to unpack two very distinct strategies for managing this exact same interpersonal terror.
And those are avoidant personality disorder, so AVPD, and dependent personality disorder, or DPD.
To set a foundation here, both of these diagnoses live in the same neighborhood of the diagnostic manual, right? The DSM-5.
Yeah, they fall under what psychiatry classifies as cluster C.
Cluster C.
Right. So the manual divides personality disorders into clusters based on overarching themes. And cluster C is explicitly the anxious or fearful cluster.
So they sit right alongside things like obsessive-compulsive personality disorder.
Exactly. And it is really vital to note here that, by definition, a personality disorder isn't just, a rough patch or a bad mood.
Right. It's not just having a bad week.
No, not at all. We are talking about a pervasive, inflexible pattern of behavior. It usually starts in late adolescence, stays stubbornly stable over time, and fundamentally impairs how a person functions in the world.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because when you look at these two side by side, it feels a bit like a contradiction.
It really does.
I mean, someone who completely avoids people and someone who intensely clings to people seem like they're operating on completely different planets.
Yeah, from the outside, they look like complete opposites.
So how do these two distinct types handle the exact same underlying dread of being alone?
Well, to understand that, we kind of have to look under the hood at the cognitive framework.
Right.
So the prominent cognitive theorist Aaron Beck mapped this out by arguing that personality patterns are basically organized around a core maladaptive belief about the self.
Like a central lie they believe about themselves.
Exactly. So for the avoidant personality, that core belief is essentially, I am fundamentally flawed, I am socially inept.
Wow.
Yeah, and they think if I let people get close enough to see the real me, they will inevitably reject me.
So the threat for them is exposure. If people see the truth, they'll leave.
That is the fear, yes. But when we flip that over to the dependent personality, their core belief is, I am helpless, I am incompetent.
Completely different angle.
Totally. They believe they absolutely cannot survive the demands of life without a stronger person to guide them.
Ah, so the threat isn't exposure. The threat is self-reliance.
Exactly. They believe that standing on their own 2 feet will just lead to their collapse.
It's almost like two different ways of bracing for a car crash.
That's a good way to look at it.
Like the avoidance strategy is preemptive rejection. It's refusing to even get in the car or on the road at all, so you just can't possibly crash. You shut out the world before the world has the chance to shut you out.
Right.
But the dependent strategy is preemptive surrender. It's getting in the car, but immediately handing over the steering wheel, the keys, the map. You completely surrender control so that someone else takes the responsibility of navigating.
That analogy captures the mechanics perfectly. Preemptive rejection versus preemptive surrender.
I like that.
And to bring this out of the abstract, the sources provide a really great real-world metric to visualize this, which they call the party test.
Oh, right. The party test.
Yeah, so let's say both of these individuals are invited to a work colleague's party where they barely know anyone.
Which is a nightmare scenario for most of us, honestly.
True, true. But watch the divergent mechanisms here. The avoidant guest is going to be tortured by this invitation for days.
They're already dreading it.
Exactly. They will likely try to find a reason to back out, and if they do force themselves to attend, they are hovering near the exit, maybe, pretending to look at their phone to avoid eye contact.
We've all seen that or been that person.
Right. And they leave early. But the crucial part happens after. They spend the next 3 days agonizing over every single interaction.
Like overthinking everything they said.
Yes, they will replay a 2-minute conversation about the weather, completely convinced they sounded stupid and that everyone noticed.
Wow, that's exhausting.
It is. And they don't do this because they hate people. They do it because the anticipated humiliation drastically outweighs their very real desire for connection.
They want to be part of the group.
Mm,
But the toll of potential rejection is just too high to risk it.
exactly.
So how does the dependent guest handle that exact same party?
Well, they go, but they immediately scan the room for an anchor.
An anchor.
Yeah, they will find the person who seems the most socially secure or assertive, and they basically just enter that person's orbit.
Oh, I see.
Right, so if the anchor says they love a certain movie, the dependent guest agrees completely, even if they actually hate it.
Mirroring them.
Exactly. If asked what appetizer they want to order, they will have no preference, because their preference is just whatever the anchor's preference is.
They completely suppress their own identity.
Yeah, to ensure the anchor doesn't get annoyed and leave them. And the moment that anchor steps away to go to the bathroom, the dependent guest experiences this massive, disproportionate spike of panic.
Oh, wow. So it's the same party, opposite mechanisms, but the exact same underlying dread.
You nailed it. Same dread.
I'm stuck on something you said about the avoidant guests, though. If they are skipping the party, hovering by the door, completely withdrawing, doesn't the outside world just assume they don't want to be around people?
Yeah, they usually do.
Like maybe they just prefer isolation.
What's fascinating here is that you've just hit on the biggest historical misconception surrounding this diagnosis.
Oh, really?
Yeah. For a long time, psychiatry itself struggled to differentiate between types of withdrawal. To clear it up, our sources actually take us back to 1969 to the work of an American psychologist named Theodore Millon.
I saw his name pop up quite a bit in the reading for this deep dive. What was his breakthrough?
Well, Millon was pretty frustrated with the older theories of the time. He wanted a model of personality based on how people actively seek pleasure or avoid pain in their environments.
Okay, makes sense.
And he specifically coined the term avoidant personality to draw this massive bright line between it and a completely different pattern called the schizoid personality.
Okay, so how do they differ? Because from the outside, an avoidant person and a schizoid person both look like they're just, sitting home alone on a Friday night.
Right. From the outside, they are identical. But Millon insisted the internal experience is completely opposite.
How so?
The schizoid individual is genuinely indifferent to relationships. They are home alone on a Friday night, and they are perfectly content. They don't have a driving need for intimacy.
Okay, and the avoidant person?
The avoidant individual desperately, intensely wants intimacy. They want the relationship, the friends, the connection, but they are totally paralyzed by the fear of humiliation.
So they're home alone, agonizing over the fact that they're alone.
Exactly.
That is a massive distinction. I mean, it totally reframes how you view someone's withdrawal. It's not apathy at all. It's a protective shell over a very intense desire.
Exactly. It's self-protection.
So if Millon defined the avoidant personality by looking at how people avoid pain, how did psychiatry map out the dependent mind? Was that Millon too?
Actually, no. DPD has a much murkier origin story.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It stems from the early 20th century psychoanalytic tradition, specifically the work of Carl Abraham and Sigmund Freud. They had this concept they called the oral character.
The oral character. That sounds incredibly strange to modern ears. How does an oral character connect to a dependent personality?
I know, it requires a bit of a leap into early psychoanalysis.
Okay, I'm ready.
The theory was that a person could become psychologically fixated at the oral stage of infant development. The stage where a baby is entirely reliant on being fed and nursed by a caregiver.
Right.
So Freud and Abraham theorized that if someone got stuck in that receptive feed me stage, it would sort of morph in adulthood into a broader psychological posture of decide for me, manage my life for me, feed my self-esteem.
So it shifts from a literal need to be fed to a metaphorical need to be sustained by someone else's decision-making.
Exactly. And over the decades, through the first 2 editions of the DSM, these traits were loosely grouped under pretty vague labels, like passive-dependent personality.
Oh, okay.
But by the time the DSM-3 was published in 1980, psychiatry shifted away from those abstract psychoanalytic theories. They moved toward the concrete, checklist-based symptom counts we use today.
Got it. So the old theory about infant feeding fixations was translated into a behavioral checklist.
Exactly. Things like needing excessive advice to make daily decisions or going to extreme lengths to obtain nurturance from others.
I need to play devil's advocate for a second regarding those checklists, though. Specifically for the avoidant criteria. Where is the line between avoidant personality disorder and just being a really strong introvert?
That is such a common question.
Because if you're listening right now, you might be thinking, hey, I hate networking events, I avoid parties where I don't know anyone, I overthink my conversations, do I have a personality disorder?
Right. It is the most common question clinicians get regarding this cluster. The distinction relies entirely on the severity of the fear and the level of clinical impairment.
So it's about how much it messes up your life.
Precisely. Introversion is just a natural temperament. It's simply a low pathology preference for low stimulation. An introvert might skip the networking event because large crowds drain their energy, and they genuinely rather read a book.
Right. They are totally content with their small circle of friends.
Yeah.
So their social battery just drains faster.
Right. Avoidant personality disorder, on the other hand, is driven by terror, not a drained battery.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
To meet the clinical threshold, we are talking about severe functional impairment. It's someone who, say, turns down a major life-changing job promotion because it requires interpersonal contact, and they are terrified of being judged.
Wow. So it actively derails their life.
Absolutely. Or someone who is totally unwilling to get involved romantically unless they have an impossible ironclad guarantee that they won't be rejected. It is a state of chronic distress.
That makes a lot of sense. Introversion is a preference. AVPD is a phobia of the interaction itself.
Exactly.
Which begs the question, where do these intense phobias and survival strategies actually begin? I mean, are people born with a genetic checklist of these fears, or is this something that gets learned over time?
To answer that, the clinical research almost universally points us back to childhood, specifically to attachment theory.
Oh, right. Developed by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth in the mid-20th century.
You got it. And the sources spent a lot of time on Ainsworth's strange situation experiments.
Yeah, for good reason, I think.
Okay.
Because the setup of that experiment visually demonstrates the roots of these disorders.
It really does. So Ainsworth would place an infant and their primary caregiver in a sterile laboratory room with some toys.
Just to observe them?
Right. Then the caregiver would leave the room for a brief period, leaving the baby alone with a stranger, and eventually return. Ainsworth painstakingly recorded exactly how the babies reacted to the separation and the reunion.
So what were they actually looking for?
They wanted to see the child's strategy for managing fear. Some infants were classified as anxious avoidant. When the mother returned, these babies seemingly ignored her.
Oh, like they didn't care.
They didn't seek comfort outwardly, but monitors showed their heart rates and stress hormones were spiking. They were terrified. But they had learned that seeking comfort resulted in rejection, so they shut down their outward needs.
Ah, the preemptive rejection we talked about earlier.
Yes. On the other end, some infants were classified as anxious resistant. They were incredibly distressed when the mother left, but when she returned, they were clingy yet angry.
Clingy but angry. That's interesting.
Right. They couldn't be easily comforted because they lacked an internal sense of security. They were entirely dependent on the external presence, but deeply anxious about its reliability.
It sounds incredibly predictive, but is it just a theory? I mean, can we really draw a straight line from a crying baby in a lab room to a 30-year-old who can't order at a restaurant without their partner's approval?
We actually can, thanks to longitudinal data. The sources highlight the Minnesota Longitudinal Study of Risk and Adaptation, which was started by Alan Shroof in the 1970s.
Okay, so they tracked these kids over time.
They literally tracked a cohort of children from infancy all the way into adulthood. And the findings showed a direct, meaningful continuity. Infants classified with those insecure attachment patterns in the strange situation experiment showed behavioral patterns decades later that map cleanly onto cluster C personality traits.
That is wild. And it totally dismantles a major social misconception. You hear people use words like clingy, or they assume someone who can't leave a toxic dynamic is just weak.
Yeah, that happens a lot.
But this research shows it's not a conscious choice to be dependent. They are executing a deeply ingrained survival strategy that was programmed into their nervous system before they could even form sentences.
Which is exactly why the just use your willpower advice is so incredibly ineffective for personality disorders.
Right?
If society views dependency as just a weakness, the presumed cure is simply to stand up for yourself. But because these are rigid, early formed cognitive beliefs, like Becca's "I am fundamentally helpless without others," willpower doesn't dent them.
You can't just wish it away.
No. Treating this requires highly structured psychotherapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy.
See?
Yes. And CBT for personality disorders isn't just, talking about your feelings. It's about a therapist systematically helping a patient identify that deep-seated core belief and then actively setting up behavioral experiments in the real world to prove to the patient's own brain that the belief is false.
It's a literal rewiring process.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If these traits exist on this messy, continuous developmental spectrum from childhood, why does modern psychiatry force them into strict, checklist-based boxes?
That is the million-dollar question.
Like the DSM says you have to meet exactly 4 out of 7 criteria for one disorder or 5 out of 8 for another. It feels a bit arbitrary, doesn't it?
It is highly arbitrary, and you have just touched on the most fierce, ongoing debate in the psychiatric literature regarding personality disorders.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Let's look at AVPD. There is another condition called generalized social anxiety disorder, or SAD. Now, SAD is what psychiatry calls an axis I disorder, meaning it's treated more as a primary clinical condition like depression rather than a foundational personality structure.
Got it.
But studies repeatedly show an enormous symptom overlap between AVPD and social anxiety disorder. In some samples, over 90% of patients diagnosed with AVPD also meet the exact criteria for generalized social anxiety disorder.
90%. If the overlap is that high, are they even distinct conditions?
Many top researchers argue they aren't.
Really?
Yeah, they suggest it's the exact same underlying mechanism, an intense fear of negative evaluation, just measured at different points on a severity spectrum.
Okay, so just different degrees of the same thing.
In this view, AVPD isn't a separate box. It's simply the more pervasive, earlier onset, deeply identity-embedded end of the social anxiety spectrum. It's a darker shade of the same color, not a different color entirely.
And there's an incredible irony here regarding Theodore Millon, right?
Yeah.
The very guy we discussed earlier who coined the term avoidant personality and championed these strict diagnostic boxes for the DSM-3.
Yes, it is one of the great ironies in psychiatric history. Millon spent much of his later career arguing against his own checklist model.
No way.
Yeah. He realized that the categorical you either have it or you don't approach was entirely too crude for human psychology.
So he completely changed his mind.
He did. He eventually advocated for a dimensional system, a spectrum, where personality traits are continuous variables. Millions of people have been diagnosed using the boxes he helped build, but the architect himself eventually realized the boxes were a flawed concept.
That's amazing.
And researchers today are still fighting that battle, pushing for spectrum models in the newest alternative sections of the DSM-5.
So the validity of AVPD as a separate box is debated clinically. But the dependent personality disorder category has an equally intense controversy, and this one is cultural.
Yes, it is.
Our sources highlight a major feminist critique from the 1980s. And just to be clear for you listening, we are going to look at this strictly as a historical debate within the psychiatric literature, not taking a political stance ourselves, but the core premise is just fascinating.
It definitely is.
In 1983, a psychologist named Marcy Kaplan published a highly influential paper questioning the very foundation of DPD.
She did. Kaplan's core question was essentially this. Aren't the diagnostic criteria for DPD, prioritizing relationships over oneself, intense deference, caretaking, constantly seeking reassurance?
Right.
Aren't those the exact traits that Western society has historically demanded of and socialized into women?
So the argument being that the DSM was pathologizing cultural compliance.
Exactly. The critique suggested that if a society explicitly tells women their primary value is in maintaining relationships and deferring to a household head,
Right.
and psychiatry turns around and diagnoses those same women with a mental disorder for doing exactly what they were taught.
There's a massive diagnostic bias baked right into the manual.
Precisely.
Did the data actually support her critique? Were women actually being diagnosed with this more often?
Historically, yes. Clinical samples show DPD was diagnosed in women at vastly higher rates than men.
Critics like Kaplan argued this didn't reflect a true biological difference in pathology, but rather a flaw in the lens psychiatry was using.
It's all about who is defining the norm.
Exactly. And this critique was so impactful that it forced subsequent revisions of the DSM to tighten the criteria for dependency and mandate that clinicians must weigh a person's cultural and gender context before diagnosing them.
Moving from those theoretical debates to the real-world impact.
Yeah.
How common are these disorders actually?
Well, the sources point to data from the National Epidemiologic Survey on Alcohol and Related Conditions.
The NISRC study.
Right. They interviewed over 43,000 adults. And the numbers tell a really surprising story. Avoidant personality disorder is quite common. About 2.4% of the U.S. adult population, which is roughly 1 in 40 people.
That is pretty common.
But dependent personality disorder is incredibly rare in the formal data, hovering around just 0.5%.
Which is a striking gap, especially because dependent traits like relying heavily on others, needing reassurance, are incredibly common in the general population.
Right.
So why the discrepancy? If dependent traits are everywhere, why is the formal diagnosis so rare compared to avoidant personality?
It circles back to what we were just discussing about cultural norms. Many clinicians suspect DPD is massively underdiagnosed because dependent behavior often gets socially normalized or even praised.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, if someone relies entirely on their partner to navigate the world, society might just say, oh, they're just incredibly devoted, or he's just a traditional family man. It flies completely under the clinical radar.
But avoidant behavior, that causes visible friction.
Exactly. Skipping work, having no romantic relationships, visibly isolating, that looks like dysfunction to the outside world, so it draws clinical attention.
But the danger of DPD flying under the radar is severe, because when we look at the real-world stakes, the consequences of that dependency can get very dark.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, one of the most sobering correlations in all of the clinical literature is the link between dependent personality disorder and intimate partner violence.
The sources were very clear on this, and it brings us right back to that terrifying paradox we started the show with.
Yes, it does. Studies of domestic violence shelters consistently find significantly higher rates of dependent personality features among the residents than in the general population.
Wow.
If you go back to the core cognitive belief of DPD, I am completely helpless and cannot survive without a stronger person, you see this psychological trap.
Because leaving an abusive partner requires a person to face the exact terror their entire personality is organized to avoid: abandonment and total self-reliance.
Right. The unconscious math they're doing is that the cost of staying and enduring the abuse somehow feels more survivable than the cost of leaving and facing the terror of being entirely alone.
That is heartbreaking.
It is. The fear of isolation is so potent, so deeply rooted in their childhood survival mechanisms, that physical safety becomes secondary to maintaining the attachment, even if that attachment is highly toxic.
So what does this all mean for you listening? Why does it matter that we split hairs over the history of the DSM, or the mechanics of infant attachment, or the difference between schizoid and avoidant?
Well, it matters because pop psychology has completely flooded our social media feeds. Every single day, you can open an app and see people throwing around terms like codependency, narcissist, or avoidant attachment in quick infographics.
Right. And while destigmatizing mental health is largely positive, the dilution of these clinical terms can be super misleading.
Absolutely. Codependency, for instance, isn't even a DSM diagnosis. It originated in addiction recovery communities to describe enabling behaviors, not personality structures.
Understanding the precise clinical boundaries of these concepts helps you distinguish between someone just having an ordinary, slightly annoying personality quirk and a truly impairing, deeply ingrained clinical pattern that requires professional intervention.
It changes how a workplace might accommodate an employee who is terrified of public presentations, realizing it's an intense anxiety issue, not a lack of ambition. And it fundamentally shifts how domestic violence shelters design their interventions.
Right, recognizing that they aren't just asking someone to walk out a door. They're asking them to face their deepest psychological terror.
These aren't just abstract labels in a psychiatric textbook. They are the invisible scripts running underneath the lives of people we interact with every single day.
Maybe even running underneath our own lives.
Yeah. We started this deep dive talking about that universal fear of losing connection, that fear of the metaphorical car crash, and how we all develop ways to brace for impact.
Which leads to a final question I think is really worth sitting with.
Let's hear it.
The next time you find yourself avoiding a social risk, skipping an event, or conversely, agreeing with someone's opinion just to keep the peace, ask yourself, are you acting out of a genuine preference? Or are you executing a preemptive strategy to ensure you aren't left alone? A preemptive rejection or a preemptive surrender. It's a heavy thought, but an important one. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.